We're starting at Genesis chapter 35, verse 1. And here is what is happening. God said to Jacob, "Get up, go up to Bethel, and live there, and make there an altar to God, who appeared to you when you fled Esau, your brother." And then Jacob said to his household and all of the others with him, "Get rid of the foreign gods that you have with you. Purify yourselves and put on fresh clothing. We're going to move on and go up to Bethel. There I will build an altar to God, who answered me when I was in such distress and stayed with me wherever I went." They gave Jacob all of the foreign gods in their possession and the earrings they were wearing, and Jacob buried them under the terebinth tree near Shechem. And while they were traveling, a terror from God fell upon the cities around them, so that none of them pursued the sons of Jacob. And Jacob and all of the people with him arrived at Luz, that is Bethel, in the land of Canaan. He built there an altar and called the place El Bethel, God, the house of God, because it was there that God was revealed to him at the time when he was fleeing from his brother. Then Devorah, Rivkah's nurse, died. She was buried below Bethel under the oak, which was given the name Alun Bakut, the oak of weeping. After Jacob arrived from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. God said to him, "Your name is Jacob, but you will be called Jacob no longer. Your name will be Israel." Thus he named him Israel. God further said to him, "I am El Shaddai. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation, indeed, a church of Gentiles will come from you. Kings will be descended from you. Moreover, the land which I gave to Abraham and Yitzhak I give to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you." Then God went up from him from there where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up a standing stone in the place where he had spoken with him, a stone pillar. Then he poured out a drink offering on it, and poured oil on it. And Jacob called the place where God spoke with him Bethel. Then they traveled on from Bethel, and while there was still some distance to go before arriving at Ephrat, which is Bethlehem, Rachel went into labor, and she had great difficulty with it. While she was undergoing this hard labor, the midwife said to her, "Don't worry, this is also a son for you." But she died in childbirth. As she was dying, she named her son Ben-Oni, but his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrat, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a standing stone on her grave. It is the standing stone of Rachel's grave to this day. And Israel continued his travels and pitched his tent on the other side of Migdal Eder. It was while Israel was living in the land that Reuven went up and slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. Jacob had 12 sons. The sons of Leah were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's slave girl, were Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's slave girl, were Gad and Asher. These were Jacob's sons, born to him in Padan Aram. Jacob came home to his father Yitzhak at Mamre near Kiryat Arba, also known as Hebron, where Abraham and Yitzhak had lived as foreigners. Yitzhak lived to be 180 years old. Then he breathed his last, died, and was gathered to his people, an old man full of years, and his sons Esav and Yaakov buried him. There's a lot going on in that chapter there. So I want to ask, as I've been in the habit of doing a little bit lately, what are your thoughts about things that just pop up here that seem curious to you? Not going into a lot of detail or anything, but what are some things that you noticed that we might want to talk about in this section? Anything curious?
What's his name there? The one that lived 180 years, Isaac.
Isaac, yeah.
Isaac, yeah. This time you hear about him for about 10 chapters.
Yeah.
The last time was when he gave the blessing to Jacob, right?
Just before he left, yeah.
And until we get him this day, I always know first of all, he must have just died off, because we're not hearing nothing about him anymore.
Yeah.
But now we find out he lives to be 180 years old, which means all the time that Jacob was gone, and even a long time after he came back, Isaac is still with him.
Yeah. And you know what's
That's
interesting?
interesting to me.
It is interesting. Isaac is a very mysterious figure in the Bible. There's not a whole lot written about him. And what's even more curious is that Jacob just barely is getting back to see his dad. I mean, he crossed over into the land of Canaan a while ago, but he didn't go south to see his dad and his brother. He went north up to Shechem.
I had that time frame all figured out once time. I don't remember how it went, but he was back quite a while.
Yeah, it seems like he was back in the land of Canaan for some time, and I don't know if maybe he felt like there was some bad blood there and he didn't want to bother Dad. I don't know. It seemed weird. Anything else that you see there that's curious to you?
I would say, I guess I've never thought about it or noticed it before, but with Rachel calling Benjamin Ben-Oni, and I just looked at that meaning, I guess, son of my sorrows, but then Jacob changed it to Benjamin, which means the right hand or I believe,
Yeah.
something like that.
That's a great insight, and we're
Not sure
definitely...
what that-
Well, we'll need to talk about that because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. I mean, there are only a handful of people in the Bible who have their names changed, and there's one of them right there. John.
I cannot find it at the moment, but didn't we read somewhere that Jacob had to take care of the Gentiles?
I threw you a curveball with that one.
Is that what I heard?
That's what you
I
heard.
read it, but I cannot read it. I cannot
Yes.
find it anymore.
Look at chapter 35, verse 11. And undoubtedly, your text does not say this because it would be I actually was reading this in the Hebrew, and I thought to myself, this is odd because literally in the Hebrew it says, I'm a nation, indeed a church of Gentiles. But no English translation that I found had translated it that way. But when you look,
Bias.
it is bias. It is a cultural bias.
Yeah.
It was very interesting to me because when I looked it up in the Hebrew, you have kahal goyim. Kahal is the Hebrew word for church, and goyim means Gentiles. So no English translation that I found had it translated that way, but that's literally what it says in the Hebrew, and I thought, I'm going to go ahead and translate it that way and put it in there and see if anybody picks up on that. It was really interesting.
Do you think that could possibly be referring to when God divorced 10 tribes?
I think
Now
that that's...
10 tribes are scattered throughout the world. I think that England, most of Europe is actually...
I think
goes
there's
back
a
to the
real...
10 tribes.
Yeah.
I mean, half of the world came from it.
Right.
You never know we may be related.
Sure.
To all we know.
There's a real possibility there, and I have something definitely talking about that in my notes because I was like, there's something here.
I tried to figure it out.
Yeah, it's a mystery, but which will probably be revealed not too far in the future from now. But yeah, that's definitely a curiosity. Angela?
Remember when we talked about division and then multiplication?
Yeah, when you were
Jacob was divided from his family and sent to Laban, and that's where the multiplication happened, and he had 11 kids.
Yeah.
Well, with the 10 tribes, the same thing happens. They are dispersed,
Oh, wow.
and then this incredible multiplication happens.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great insight, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But that's definitely one of the key things in this section that is not unique to this section. That is basically the same promise that God gave to Abraham and to Isaac. It's just that when we read those sections, that's basically the exact same words that God spoke to Abraham and Isaac. And we may have discussed that. I think we discussed it when we talked about Isaac receiving the same blessing. But it was given to Abraham on at least 2 occasions. It was given to Isaac on at least 1 occasion. And so far it's been 3 occasions that it has happened to Jacob. It was one of the blessings that was spoken over him by his own father. It was his blessing that was spoken over him when he left the land of Canaan and met God at Bethel the first time. And then it's repeated here when he comes back into the land of Canaan at the same place. So that is not that a direct Hebrew translation to a church of Gentiles is not unique to this particular passage. It happens repeatedly. And that is, I think, one of those very interesting hidden messages in the Torah, which we're going to discuss a little bit further. Anything else that you found curious, interesting here? Yes, sir.
What we talked about last week is he's called Israel twice in verse 22 and then called Jacob at the end.
Right.
Referred to as Jacob.
Yes. And did you, I hadn't put anything in my notes about that, but do you have any insight into contextually why that might have been used that way? In this section, I mean? I'm not suggesting you should or could, but that's a hard one to do. But yes, you are correct.
Yeah, living in the land?
That could be. Some have suggested that. Yeah, Angela?
I noticed that there's this theme with Jacob, this identity confusion thing happening from the time he's born,
Sure.
with whether he's purposefully doing it or not. And so this whole thing with his being going back and forth and back and forth, it's almost like there's something about this one where it's really hard to nail down just who he is.
Identity confusion.
Which is what has happened with
It's happened with the Gentiles and with the people of God throughout history. We shouldn't be surprised by that, I guess.
This blindness thing, where
No, carry on if you like.
well, there's a whole bunch of references in the last several chapters about just this being able to see or not being able to see. There's the well of the God who sees, and all this stuff. And I think that there's something in here about, how Isaac made that mistake because he couldn't see very well, and we were like, well, he's going blind. And then even Jacob, doesn't he go blind at the end of his life?
Yeah, that's correct.
But then there's blindness and it was imparted, and they can't identify the Messiah correctly.
Sure.
So again, identity confusion because of blindness, and maybe that somehow is being woven into this whole story. This is how how he will multiply his kingdom to include much more than anyone could have ever imagined because of blindness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's good insights. Jerry?
Another one, when Rachel stole the idols, I think it's in verse 18, her death was the result of the curse that Jacob put on whoever stole those idols.
Right.
Well, this is what I've been taught anyways.
Yeah, that's common teaching.
Tradition, or it may be, I don't know if it's true or not, but
That's a common understanding, is that this is part of something that happened here because of that this is the fulfillment of him making that oath, speaking that curse, however you want to put it.
And then the change of garments.
Yes.
I read was a spiritual renewal.
I totally agree with that. Yes, absolutely. And there's some interesting parallels that we'll talk about in relation to that, but I think there's something special about removing the idols, the earrings, changing the clothes, and purifying your body is literally what it says in Hebrew. So that's a curious thing. Angela?
They buried all those things underneath an oak. Here's the terebinth. And then a few verses later it says Deborah died and they buried her under an oak. So I think there might be a tie there with what her name means.
Oh, you guys
are... her name meaning bee. You remember the river that Jacob just crossed was...
The Jabbok?
We talked about last week, meant pollination. There was this tie to it. Which, and that whole multiplication idea.
Sure. No, you guys are all picking up some really good stuff, which is exactly what I was seeing as I was reading this section. And so I think it's definitely time for us to break it out a little bit and see what we got. One of the things I want to do before we go is to kind of do just a brief geographical study of where this is happening, because we don't do that a lot of times, and I think it's not a bad idea to kind of get a feel for what is happening here. This red arrow coming up off of the top here is showing that he's coming from the area of Mesopotamia, Babylon, what would today be modern Iraq. He's coming from up here, Haran, Padan Aram, Uncle Laban's house, right? So he comes here to Mahanaim, which is where he says apparently he sees some angels, and he calls it Mahanaim, which means the camp of God, or two camps. And so that's the first place that he comes to, is two camps. And then he wrestles with the angel across the Jabbok River, and he calls that place Peniel, meaning the face of God. And then he crosses over into the land of Canaan and hangs out at Shechem, which is what we read about the last time we were together, where his daughter Dinah was raped, unfortunately. And then he begins to head south. And what's interesting is that a lot of maps will show Bethel right here, but a lot of interpreters have suggested that Bethel is literally a reference to Jerusalem, so it should actually be located a little bit further south. But there's some confusion about that. And so he goes to Bethel, which is about what we're reading about today. As they are traveling from Bethel to Bethlehem, which is south of Jerusalem, is where Benjamin is born and Rachel dies. And then they continue a little bit further south to Mamre, or Hebron, which is where Isaac dies. There's a lot of death in this section of Scripture. We got Rebecca's nurse Devorah dying, we got Rachel dying, and we have Isaac dying, all in this section. And so that's just a little geographical layout for you to kind of show where things are happening. The only caveat is this might actually be here and not there. So some question about that. I have no idea what this green arrow is. You can ignore that. Questions about that? Just a little geography lesson there. All right, now the first thing that I want to take a look at is this section where it says, get rid of the foreign gods among you, purify yourselves, and put on fresh clothing. Now, this was kind of interesting. These are literally images of Canaanite gods that I just pulled off of a Google image search. These are literally ancient artifacts of Canaanite religious items. Now, I was puzzled about the earrings, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Now, one of the first questions is, I think Tammy brought up a second ago, was what is the deal here with the removal of idols and earrings, washing the clothing, and washing bodies? What's interesting is that the Hebrew doesn't literally say washing bodies, it says purify yourselves, and it uses the word, it's like ritually purify. Like you're taking a baptism or a mikvah bath before you go up onto the Temple Mount or something, which is interesting since they are going to the house of God, which is where theoretically the temple would be later. It's almost like this is a presaging of the temple somehow, because they are washing their clothing, purifying themselves, removing gold earrings, and getting rid of the idols. Now, Tammy, I mentioned that there's probably some spiritual symbolism going on here with these things. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, it's got to be true. There's definitely some symbolism going on there. Angela?
Kind of reminds me of the Sinai thing, with the earrings,
Yeah.
the idols, and the washing yourself,
Yeah.
and the getting new clothes on, and then...
Yep. Okay, so hold on to that thought for just a second. What would you say maybe that if these things symbolize something, what do you think that they might symbolize?
Spiritual cleansing.
Spiritual cleansing? Yes, absolutely. Okay, so you can lump all of these things or items, however you want to do it, into the category of cleanse yourselves spiritually. And so in that sense, what might an idol symbolize that we need to remove from ourselves? I mean, you might say, well, you got to get rid of idolatry in your lives. And we've talked about this before. It's like most people think, stuff like this is That's from the ancient world. We don't really have idolatry anymore. Is that true? That is absolutely not true. So what are some examples of idols today?
Sports.
Sports could be yes. Anything you worship. Video games could be.
No, it most
Money. No, it most definitely can be. Money, absolutely. Angela?
Anything you fear more than God.
Anything you fear more than God. That's a good point. Yes. Giving your fear to something is, and I've mentioned that before over the years, and that gets right to the heart of us, because all of us have our own little fears about this or that, or our children, or our health, or whatever. Your health can be an idol. Your children can be an idol. I think that's absolutely true. Anything you give your fear to can begin to rule over you. You begin to make decisions based on the fear, or whatever it is. Decisions that
You can't give it up, and it's probably an idol.
yeah.
You can't do without it,
Yeah.
or do without it.
Yeah. And you know what? I would assume, because I would look to myself, that each of us has them. It's not like we're all idol free. I can't imagine. If you're not, come see me later. Tell me how you did it. But that's a challenging one. Gracie?
If you think that you don't have any idols, you better get into the Word and say, "Search me, O God."
Yes. That is the appropriate response. If you don't think you have idols in your life, you might want to say a prayer to God to say, "God, show me, because my eyes are blind and I can't see the idols in my life."
What if people know that they did, but they got through it, and then they no longer do it?
That's a great step in the right direction.
No, I'm not saying.
No, I know. I'm just saying, no, that's a great, to be delivered from an idol in your life is a great accomplishment. And that's always a life-changing event. It usually is, whether you've gotten rid of something in your life that was causing a stumbling block, or that you were, that was being treated like an idol, that usually comes with a big sense of freedom and a big sigh of relief, or whatever it is, So that's usually a milestone, for people. But there's always something else ready to take its place. Idolatry is insidious, and we often think that this just doesn't apply to us because we don't have these kind of little stone images and stuff. Some people do. It's not totally unheard of in the world today. I mean, there are Buddhists or whatever, or some of these weirder Eastern religions still do have real idols. But most of Western civilization got rid of that stuff years ago because we became enlightened through science. We have technological idols. Could be, technology could be an idol. Sure, a cell phone. Sure, absolutely. I mean, there was the power went out here. I don't know if that probably didn't affect most of you, because somebody down on the corner down there ran into a transformer and knocked out the power here. Did you get your power knocked out? Or you're probably a little too far away. But yeah, for like a couple of miles around this area, there was no power in the middle of the summer. That was that was Wednesday. Yeah. So that's trying to live here. And, what's that?
We were over there at the me and Evan were at the orthodontist right
Yeah.
across the street there.
Oh, no.
So yeah,
Cancel everything from
trying to live here in the desert, or without electricity, would be impossible, frankly. Without a computer, without a cell phone. Air conditioner. I'm worried more about the air conditioner, Jerry. I'm telling you what, you'd be dying out here. They'd be dropping like flies here in Arizona without some air conditioning.
Yeah, I know, it's my freezer.
Your freezer, your refrigerator. And I'm not saying those things are idols. Don't hear me say that. I mean, we need those things, and God knows that we need those things. But, it's,
Depends on the importance of
that's true. We become dependent.
the importance of the Lord.
Sure, absolutely. Now, I did have a little bit of trouble with the earrings, because I had trouble. There was another section in I think it's Exodus or possibly Numbers, where it's like, tell the people to take the earrings out of their ear. I'm not talking about when they took them out and gave them to Aaron and he created the golden calf. There was another incident that something about earrings, and it took me a while, and I did find some evidence to suggest that that a pomegranate earrings. It was just a little tiny bud. You know what a pomegranate looks like? Just a little ball with that little thing that comes out the top. What does a pomegranate symbolize to you? I mean, think about what a pomegranate is and what's inside of it. It's full of seeds that might represent fertility and fruitfulness. So it's a good chance that these little pomegranate earrings and such might represent the Babylonian goddess Astarte or Asherah or Ishtar, because she's the goddess of fertility. But she's usually, created as symbol of like a bare-breasted woman of some kind. But there are other symbols which work that out. Tracy, sorry.
Pomegranate was the goddess fertility for the Greeks. That was her fruit.
There you go.
So.
Yeah. Now I think that what they did is they adopted Astarte, because the Greeks aren't even really. I mean, they're around, but they haven't really got rolling yet. So it's going to be a little while before they get up to speed.
Astarte is the same woman through all these cultures.
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, it's the same woman dispersed through all these cultures. Absolutely. So. The earrings are likely some type of religious tokens or talismans of some kind, which would be considered an idol of a different type. And then washing the clothing. What do you think about the symbolism of washing clothing? What might that symbolize? Well, let's do it in reverse. If he tells them to purify themselves, and a lot of your texts might say take a bath or wash yourselves, that's literally not what it means. It means to purify yourself. To me, that is most usually associated with a mikvah, with a baptism of some kind, but it also could be related to just a spiritual cleansing, which is probably related to repentance and purifying the conscience, right? But Peter... Yes, absolutely. And Peter tells us in 1 Peter that, remember he said that baptism symbolizes not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but the appeal to God for a clean conscience. And so it's likely that what is happening here with the washing themselves, purifying themselves, is some type of a spiritual cleansing. It could be related symbolically to a baptism type of thing, but it's more than likely a repentance type of thing.
Isn't there a scripture that says something about the washing of the water of the word?
Yes, that's in James. Yes, I believe. That could, yes, I think that's a good picture to look at, is washing yourselves in the Word. Yeah, absolutely, I think so. So if that's true, and I have no reason to think that it's not, then how would you relate washing your clothing? What would that symbolize? Because the clothing is external. What might that symbolize?
The things that you have clinging kind of to your clothing from the world around you, things that you just kind of have latched onto and haven't paid attention to them, or
Yeah, that could be. Angela?
They cover you. What you do if you're covering.
Mm-hmm.
You're covering.
Mm-hmm. Wash your covering. I think that could symbolize. Well, what? Okay, I like what you're putting down there, Angela. But what do you mean that might? What do you think that might symbolize? Is wash your covering.
Well, when I use the word covering like that, I'm thinking of like atonement when we talk about the tabernacle, that one piece, the covering.
Yeah.
He is our covering.
Yes, that's a good idea. You know, one of the things that I'm thinking of too is that if this is an internal reality, purify yourselves, and then this is an external reality, wash your clothing, this is faith and works. Behave the way that you behave, the things that you do, the things that you say, that's the external things that people can see. Purify your deeds. Purify your hearts and your minds and your spirits. Purify your deeds and remove idolatry from you. This is like a revival. I think that the family of Jacob had a little big tent revival there on the way to Bethel. And it's possible even that Jacob gave him a little sermon, to tell him, this is what we need to do. We're going down to the house of God, and we are entering the land of Canaan, and we are going to be worshiping this God, and we need to establish ourselves. And I think that somebody mentioned a moment ago about there being some similarities to when they left Egypt and started going to Mount Sinai. There are some tremendous parallels and symbolisms going on there for sure.
Yeah, I was just going to say with this, as far as the parallels, it's like, beginning right here, they have this little moment, and then just a few verses later, you have Reuben sleeping with his father's concubine.
Yep.
What happened?
And you have some death.
Yeah, that's him.
And you have some fruitfulness. So there's so many different parallels to what's happening here and what's happening when they approach Mount Sinai. Very, very interesting. My next question would be, would you relate the removal of this earring thing to the making of the golden calf? Angela?
The Young's Literal Translation says, when it's talking about Jacob's flock, the sheep that were his and not Laban's, it uses the word ring streaked. And then when we were back talking about when Eleazar went to pick up Rebecca,
Yeah.
he gave her that ring, and we looked at the ring and the bracelets, and that the ring went in her nose, and it was a half shekel. And when we were in Matthew, the half shekel was
The temple
that's what they
tax.
paid.
Yeah.
I think this ring thing might have something to do with ownership and who you belong to.
That's good insight. That's good insight. Yeah, I don't know. The rings in the ears and the rings in the noses and whatnot is just it's a curious thing. And I think it's certainly possible that, they picked up some idolatrous practices when they were hanging out in Mesopotamia with Uncle Laban. And it makes sense that they would have also picked up some idolatrous practices when they were hanging out in Egypt for 250 years or 400 years, however long you want to, do the chronology on it. And that they needed to be purified as they were approaching either Mount Sinai or Bethel, which is the mountain of the house of God in Jerusalem. I think there's some definite things that are connected here for sure. Gracie?
Does that have anything to do, any parallel with, in the New Testament, we talked about when someone was indentured to a person but really loved them and didn't want to leave, and they
Pierce their ear. Yeah. That's an interesting question. Yeah, that's an interesting question because, when it talks about in Exodus piercing the ear and becoming the servant perpetually of that person, it doesn't say anything about an earring. It just says that you now have a hole in your ear from an awl, but it doesn't say anything about an earring. Okay, that's an excellent insight. The hole won't stay there if you don't put something in it. What might that symbolize? Think about that for a second.
I thought that the earring that they put in when they put their ear against the doorpost or whatever and used the oil to get it in there.
Yeah.
And then the earring was an indication, a public statement that, just like my wedding band.
Sure.
Some guy's wondering,
are you available, Gracie?
Available or not? They'll see a wedding band and they know.
It says you belong to someone.
Right. Yeah.
You've given your
And I think
allegiance.
that those earrings say that they belong to some other god, and so he's having them get rid of that.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I am not suggesting that they didn't put an earring in when they pierced the ear with an awl. All I'm saying is it doesn't say anything about it. It just says they will pierce the ear with an awl. But you would assume that, they would have to put an earring in there because the hole would close up. It would heal. But I have also heard that, Gracie, about, that earring being a symbol of ownership. And that makes a lot of sense from this perspective of they are showing...
kind of ownership.
Right.
It's I give you myself to you ownership.
Right.
Not them saying you're mine.
Yeah, it's a voluntary, yes, absolutely. It's a good point.
You think that could represent the Holy Spirit?
Which thing?
I said, do you think that hole could represent the Holy Spirit when you fill it with something?
That's awesome. That's a good idea. That's possible, yeah.
That's reaching.
That's reaching. No, it's an interesting metaphor. We'd have to explore that a little bit, but yeah, that could be. So I want to go to the next question. Has to do with the similarity to the preparation of approaching Mount Sinai. I think, as we've mentioned just a couple of times here, there's definitely some serious parallels going on here between the people preparing themselves to hear the Ten Commandments from God on Mount Sinai, because Moses tells them, what does Moses tell them when they're getting ready to hear from God on Mount Sinai?
Wait up for 2 days.
Purify yourselves, wash your clothes, be ready for the third day, and one other thing that he throws in there.
Sexual relations.
Yes. He says, do not go near your wives. Which is a curious thing because God did not tell him to say that. He repeated everything that God said, word for word, except for that one thing he added. What do you make of that? I personally think that is Moses adding one of the, that is him adding a fence around the Torah. I think that's one of the earlier examples of an interpretation, a doctrine, if you will. Do I think that it was okay? It certainly could be. It is certainly possible that in Egypt the people had picked up maybe some sexual practices which were unclean, that were defiling, and that Moses was interpreting when God said, purify yourselves, change your clothing, and be prepared for the third day, that Moses knew, you know what, it'd probably be a good idea if you stayed away from your wives for a couple days, because you might defile yourselves as we're getting ready to hear from God. But God did not tell him to say that. So I think that that's an early indication of Moses interpreting what God said and laying down a new rule. Interesting idea. So yeah, there's definitely some some comparisons there. You know, the family of God, Jacob's family, seems to be having a lot of these come to Jesus moments throughout their history. They have, it's repeated that they have to purify themselves and remove the idols and wash their clothing and purify themselves. Do you, I don't know, I remember when we were back in the church, all those years, you ever known anybody who went to the altar call anytime there was one? Yes, because I think I frankly did it myself a couple times. Anytime there was I didn't do it anytime there was an altar call, but I did it more than once. Sure enough, that it was like, well, you're not really getting saved this time. You're just like a rededication. They would call it a rededication or something like that. I want to rededicate my efforts or whatever. You know what? We do that. And we probably, frankly, should do that every once in a while, And I think that it keeps happening with Jacob and his family, the Israelites, the Christians, whatever. I mean, it wasn't, you remember Jonathan Edwards preaching that sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, or, just after the Civil War. Oh, they were coming out of the woodwork, man, in these big tent revival meetings, calling out to God. It was where, they came up with the altar call. That's what God's people do and probably should do, is continuously be evaluating themselves and decide, you know what, it might be time for me to renew my vows to God.
Might be even more effective a lot of times to do it privately in your home. Daily.
Yeah. Yes. No, that's a great thing. I think that doing it in private, between you and God, I have to do that.
It doesn't become a pride thing for people to see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Between you and
Right. So yeah, I think that this right here is something that we just have to hold on to, and we have to do at various times throughout our lives, to purify ourselves from idols, wash our clothing, and cleanse ourselves, just repeatedly. It has to happen.
Yeah, I think that in life, the closer you get to God, the more He reveals to you. Thank God He doesn't reveal everything at once.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think when He reveals you know, usually for me it's one thing at a time. Like, I need you to work on this.
Yeah.
Or somebody points out a flaw and you just have to be open for change. And
Right.
you just have to change it and go, wow, okay, I, you know, wasn't aware that I acted that way, or maybe you are aware and then you have to make those changes. So, yeah, I think that it's constantly going before God with, you know, thank you for showing me my flaws so I can,
Yeah.
you know.
It takes some spiritual eyes to see, and we may have to get beat around the head and shoulders a little bit because nobody likes to acknowledge their own flaws. Even if it's just something that's not really a spiritual thing, it always is a spiritual thing, but we may not perceive it that way. It's like people at work, you know, somebody corrects us. I don't know about you, but you know, the scripture is not mistaken when it says you correct a fool, you're just going to get a boot. Because I have not been particularly gracious when people correct me. I don't like to be corrected. That is not... The first reaction is self-preservation, and that is pure flesh.
And that's how you know it's true.
That's how you know it's true. That's right.
You become defensive.
Yes.
But you know, you know, I have to say, like, when we have monthly meetings, you know, with the kids, and we did that. They would tell us what, you know, I know, and sometimes it would be just about me, or about, you know, it could be about anybody, but, you know, and they'd say, you do this, and we notice that, and I go, wow, okay.
It bothers
so
us.
I have to not get upset about it and say, if I really do this, if they say I'm doing it, then I have to look at it and say, okay,
Sure.
I guess maybe they're right, or, you know, am I really doing that, or is it made
Well,
up?
you know that
So-
the Bible says that the faithful are the wounds of a friend. So you look at the motivation of somebody who comes to you with correction. If it's your own child or someone who loves you, that's one thing. But yes, I think that's a key consideration that you mentioned a minute ago. Is it's like if your initial gut reaction is to flinch back and you get defensive, that's a good indication that there might be something to look at. There might be something there. If your initial reaction is, what? That doesn't make any sense. It might be, I don't know, that's a good question. It's like, if you feel defensive, there might be something there. If you're confused by it, there might still be something there, but, you know, think about it. So yeah, having somebody who's faithful and pointing something out it's always challenging. But when it comes from a friend, you hopefully know that they really care about you and they want to, go ahead.
Just be careful who you listen to.
That's true.
Because I have a friend. I should still consider her a friend, but we're miles apart. We seldom speak, you know. But she wanted us to get together and devote, quiet time together and stuff. Kind of study the Word together and share with each other what we thought the Lord was showing us and stuff. And I became aware very quickly that what she wanted to do was sit down and show me all the things that are wrong in my life. So, it was interesting.
The spirit was not correct.
No.
Yeah.
No, but the Lord used that in my heart
Sure.
to really search and ask the Lord to show me if this is true.
Yeah.
Then, otherwise, and I just told her finally one day, I said, Carol, I can't keep being like this because you're just beating me down.
Yeah.
I said, I need you to tell me some things you think the Lord is showing you that He is having victory in my life, or I'm having victory with.
Yeah.
And
Well,
met a couple of times after that, we couldn't find anything.
Yeah. Well, that's there are people with a judgmental spirit who just want to point out what you're doing wrong, and their heart's probably in the wrong place. But can we learn from that? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Sure we can, and probably should. Good point. Yeah, good
I
point.
decided right then and there that I needed to be asking the Lord to show me not,
Sure. Yeah.
not just leaving it undone.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Someone with a critical spirit who just wants to point out our flaws, they got their own issues, obviously, but can we learn from that? Yeah, we certainly can. Angela?
Probably trying to feel better about themselves.
Yeah.
Probably unhappy.
Yeah, that's undoubtedly true. That's one of the most common things that people do to feel better about themselves is to get somebody near you under your thumb somehow has this thing that just makes you feel a little better about yourself if you can put your thumb on somebody else. That's an unfortunate tendency that our flesh has to. That's what that's not a good way to feel better, but it tends to work in the fleshly manner. It does.
But if you don't work on the things that God shows you, or that if somebody else tells you you're doing something, and you know, and you're convicted of it, I'm telling you, you better change it. If you don't, there have been many times where I didn't, and
it can get ugly.
questions for that are not good.
That's right. No, you're right. You're right. Yeah, what's that?
I said, when the Lord points it out,
It's time to act.
it's time to act.
Yeah.
It's going to hurt worse if you don't.
Yeah.
That's very true. Very true. I agree with that. I agree. So where did all these idols come from that Jacob found in his family? We were dealing with just a bunch of idolaters here. How did all of these idols get them creep into his family?
Battles, maybe?
That is one of the battles, perhaps.
What was it, a chapter after or before?
Yeah, it was a chapter before this one where they had that big battle in Shechem where the sons of Jacob went and slaughtered that whole village, and it says that after that they went and took all the loot. And so it is possible that they picked up some idols with the stuff that they took.
Didn't Laban's family all be surrounded by it?
Yeah, there's also the possibility. Yeah, there's definitely. We know that Rachel stole her father's idols, so there's one set right there, and then it's possible that some of the people, maybe even his own sons, maybe even some of his wives, other than Rachel, had just brought the servants that they brought from Padan Aram, had idols with them. It's also possible that they picked some up when they sacked the city of Shechem. But it doesn't seem likely to me. The common rabbinic interpretation is that they got these idols when they sacked the city of Shechem. Now, that, however, doesn't, because that just happened. Now, I don't know how much time passed between the sack of the city of Shechem and what's going on here, but it probably wasn't very long. And so the rabbinic interpretation is they had idols in their possession, but they weren't really worshiping them. They just were among the loot. It's like, I don't think so. I don't think so. We know that Rachel has had some idols from her father for some time. We never heard of what happened to those idols, but presumably she still has them. And I think that there's some indication in my mind, and this is pure speculation, that perhaps Jacob knew about it all along. And somebody brought up something to me as a kind of just a question, and that was, did Jacob have a perception in his mind that this God, who is the God of his fathers and who appeared to him at Bethel, does he have a perception in his mind that that God is the only God? Or is that the God of his family? The God of the land of Canaan? And I frankly didn't really know how to answer that question. There is a possibility, I suppose, that the Hebrew conception of God at this time wasn't that well defined. It would have been totally commonplace for most peoples all over the world to think of gods everywhere. The Egyptians have tons of God. The Hittites have tons of gods. The Mesopotamians have tons of gods. It might have somehow, I don't know how, but it might have occurred to Jacob and his family that this God who appeared to him at Bethel was simply the God of his fathers, the God of the land of Canaan. They may not have had a perception of like one God that, all the others are fake or something. I don't know. That comes later with...
Enoch was before this, wasn't
Mm-hmm.
he? And wasn't there a close enough relationship in generations
that is, yes.
Should have known?
That is one of the speculations. Rabbis have speculated continuously that Jacob, they even say that when he left his father's house to go to Padan Aram, that he actually stopped off for a year or so to study with great-great-grandpa Shem. That's pure rabbinic speculation. But yes, the timeline of the history that you can find in your Bible charts shows that both Adam was alive for some time and that Shem was still alive here. And so would they have known from those descendants of Noah that there is only one God? Possibly. But you know what? We don't have anything definitive in the Torah that talks about Abraham, or that talks about Enoch. I mean, Enoch certainly did, because he was translated and had direct revelation from God. But did Noah? Was Noah keenly aware that there is only one God? I don't know. It's a weird speculation, but it's just something that I hadn't ever considered.
Why not?
I don't know.
Why didn't we consider it? I mean, why would they not?
That is a puzzler to me. Some have just speculated because it doesn't, the idea of monotheism or monotheism, of there being only one God, comes considerably later in the Torah, when God begins to explain to these people there are no other gods. I am the only God. And some have speculated, did some of these ancient Hebrew people not really know that? Maybe God, and they have speculated, maybe God did not reveal that to them right away. Maybe it's enough for him, he's gracious, and that he began to reveal himself to them. He doesn't need to necessarily blow their minds all at once. I don't know. It's a curious thing. Just one sec, Jared.
You brought up the Enoch.
Yeah.
According to the book of Enoch, he was writing down every vision that he had to give to his father Methuselah before he was, because he knew he was going to be translated.
Right.
Now Methuselah died just a day before the flood. And it seemed to me that Methuselah might have given those writings to Noah, and they might have committed the new will on the ark.
I certainly would think so.
I mean, it just makes sense to me. How would
Yeah.
Abraham and how would Job have known how to worship God
Right.
and things like that?
Yeah, that's a
They knew
great
they
question.
needed to do the sacrifices and
Yeah.
stuff for forgiveness.
Yeah.
First thing
Yeah.
Noah did was he built an altar and did a sacrifice.
Right. But that you got to remember too that building an altar and making a sacrifice on an altar is terribly common amongst all those God worshipers. That's not a unique thing to Yehovah.
And when Noah landed, he was the only one.
That's true. That's true.
So,
Well, about if they knew or not if there's any other gods, but I think the Bible's clear. Israel always left for other gods, so apparently they thought there was some price in worshiping a statue.
Yeah, that's a good point, frankly, Darren. I mean, later on, they would have most assuredly known there's only one God, and all these other gods are fake, and yet they went and worshiped them. Somehow.
What about it? Is it not First Corinthians when Paul talks about gods and plural? I don't remember exactly where it was, but somewhere I believe in the beginning.
Yeah.
Specifically talking about gods.
He says we know there are many gods, but that there's only really one. Because, I think he's acknowledging.
It's almost that he says from there are more gods.
Yes.
Like we have this one.
Well, yes, that's true, and I think that what he's referencing there is we acknowledge that there are gods all over the place, but they're not really gods. They exist out there in the world because people think they do, and he may have even been making reference to spiritual forces, demonic forces, because God has mentioned previously that whenever you are engaged in false worship or you commit idolatry and begin to worship foreign gods, he says you're worshiping demons. And so that may have been what Paul is talking about when he says, now we know that there are many gods out there, but that there's really only one. I think that that's probably what he's referring to is we got to acknowledge that there's tons of people out there worshiping tons of gods. They're not really gods, but they think they are. And in a sense, if they're spiritual forces of darkness, well, to a human that might seem like a god. So that's fair enough to call it that if you want to. It's a spiritual force. Angela, I apologize. You wanted to throw something out there?
No.
You're all good? Okay. Tammy?
I have a question.
Yeah.
When he changed the name, and I know it's back, but
Yeah.
when he changed his name to Israel, does his new name mean wrestle or struggle with God?
Yes, there are several different interpretations of Yisra, which is one is struggles with God, one is Prince of God.
Was it because he wrestled an angel and then
Yes, from a literal perspective, yes. That right there in that around that section, he had been struggling with. It says, you've fought with man and God and have prevailed. So in a literal sense, he had been struggling with man for some time against his brother, against his uncle Laban, and he had prevailed over both of them. But he had also been realistically, when we looked at it from a spiritual perspective a couple of weeks ago, we determined that really he was struggling with God the whole time, and had finally come to the realization that he had been struggling with his belief and his problems that he thought was caused by the people around him, but it was actually him struggling with God. And then he literally wrestles with an angel. And so, yes, it is most connected with that. Yeah, absolutely. Angela?
I was just going to, because she wasn't here for that. When he is wrestling with that angel, it was nighttime when it started, and the last thing he heard was Esau's on the way.
Yeah.
So he thinks, as Esau said, the last thing Esau said to him was, I'm going to kill you. He thinks he is wrestling with Esau until the sun comes up and he can see, and he sees that it's God. And so that's why he says the whole time he thinks he's fighting with him, and he thinks he's fighting with his brother. Really what who he's fighting with when he can see is God. And that's when they say, you have wrestled with God and man and have prevailed.
Yeah. I think that's a good metaphor for him to think, okay, I've been struggling all this time, and I thought I was struggling with my circumstances. I was really struggling with God being in control and me wanting control. Such a huge lesson for all of us, for sure. But yeah, that's a good one. Anything else?
So I notice like a pattern when he changes names. It just seems like then I always try and figure out why is he always changing names. I think it's always a good thing when he changes the name. But I also read one day it had to do with that even when we are called into heaven, we will not have our earthly name, but he will give us a new name.
Sure, yeah.
I think I just read that a few weeks ago, something about that, and I thought, well, that's really interesting too.
Yeah, it is. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, where it was like, there's not very many Bible characters who have their names changed. And yes, in the book of Revelation, it talks about, believers receiving a new name, a stone on it with the new name that only they know, But that what's odd about this is that, Abraham has his name changed from Abram to Abraham, and he's never called Abram again. In fact, Jews typically think that if you call Abraham Abram, it's kind of an insult. And then, people who have their name changed, it sticks, but not this guy. It's like continuously throughout his life, and just in this section that Darren had pointed out earlier, sometimes he's referred to as Jacob, and sometimes he's referred to as Israel. And is there some consistency to the pattern of when he's called Israel and when he's called Jacob? I've never read anybody who has found some kind of a pattern in there which talks about why his name is used in one way and in another. I don't know. It's really confusing to me. Angela?
When you consider that, if you go home and want to think about that, where Abraham's name just had one letter added to it. It was the letter for breath or spirit. Jacob's name, he kept one letter, and all the other letters got changed. And the one letter he kept was the letter for hand.
For what?
Yod.
Oh, hand. I thought, okay, yeah. Yeah, it's a curious name change, and it doesn't seem to stick. He keeps being referred to one way or the other throughout his life. It's really, really strange. I think that's my last question. No. The quick question, and it's nothing, terribly earth-shaking, but why did they bury these idols under an oak tree instead of, burning them, destroying them, or, whatever? Do you have any ideas about that? What might that symbolize? Any ideas?
What does oak tree mean? What is the spiritual significance in Hebrew?
Well,
Isn't it one of the hardest woods?
it is a very tough, strong wood, and it's the Hebrew word alon. I don't know I'm sure you could find some Hebrew mysticism that kind of describes, what is the significance of that oak tree. But I don't know what it is. I know that's a good point that it is one of a really strong, dense wood, but I'm not sure. I just wondered, why did they bury these idols instead of destroying them?
Perhaps they were afraid to destroy.
That's possible. If they
Prayed for the power in them and
sure.
and stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what's that?
To dig them back up.
Yeah, I don't know.
In case they ever need them.
Well, it says that Jacob did it.
That's what you do with things that aren't
Things that aren't what?
alive.
Yes, it occurred to me that this is some type of a burial ceremony, which is weird. But you know what? It's you know what's interesting, and if you relate this back to the previous couple of questions here, where it talks about when you approach Sinai, think about what happened in Egypt, and we've talked about this before when we studied the book of Exodus. What were all of those plagues? They were plagues, they were judgments against the gods of Egypt. And every one of those plagues was a direct, killing of one of their gods. And then you find here, they don't burn these idols, they bury them, which is symbolic of death. So that's another little bit of a parallel there to where these gods are dead. Just an idea. I can't say that definitively, but it's interesting to think about. That how the gods of Egypt were dealt death blows by our God. It's like, oh, you want to worship that God? I'll kill your God. When the river Nile turns to blood, it's like, oh, the Nile God is dead. Then the sun goes out and there's pitch black for 3 days. Oh, the sun God is dead. I don't know. Just something to think about. I'm not really sure why they buried them. I know you could possibly say, well, they wanted to go back and get them later, but Jacob certainly wouldn't do that, would he? I don't know.
Might also be, this makes me think of what we were talking about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
about did the Israelites, did Jacob, and then know there was only one supreme God. Well, they hadn't come out of Egypt yet, though, so they didn't see that with Pharaoh and the army being buried by the
In the
God
sea.
who
Yeah.
is in control of the
Yeah.
sea.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that wouldn't work either. So.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's a curious question. Now, in regards to Deborah, there's not a whole lot of mystery here. I mean, there is a great mystery here, but there's no possible answer for it. But I just wanted to bring it to your attention, that Deborah it says that she's Rebecca's nursemaid, wet nurse. Now, that could go either way. Does that mean that she nursed Rebecca when Rebecca was a child, or that she nursed Rebecca's children? I don't know. If she nursed Rebecca, that'd be a really old woman. Now, that's not to say that she couldn't be a really old woman, because, right here at the end of this chapter, we've got Jacob, or Isaac being 180 years old. So is it possible that she was a super old woman? Sure, I suppose. But it could be more likely that she was another servant that was given to Rebecca, and that she was a nursemaid who took care of Rebecca's children. And that is perhaps what she's doing here with Jacob to begin with, is that she might have taken care of Jacob when he was a child. And that's why she's with him. So what does her death symbolize then? That's uncertain to me. Why does she just pop up out of nowhere? The woman we've never heard of before. There's only 2 women in the Bible who are called Deborah. It's rather curious. It's a curiosity, and I'm not exactly sure how to answer the question. But it's curious to me that she is buried under an oak and that the idols were buried under a terebinth. I don't know if that's symbolic in some way. That the text seems to be, somehow to me, is making some type of a connection between her being buried under a tree and these idols being buried under a tree. Some have speculated that she, because she came from Mesopotamia, represents somehow a spiritual link between Mesopotamia and this family, a link that needs to be broken. then that's why she died? I don't know. It's a curiosity, but I don't know exactly what to make of it. What would you say is odd about the death of Rachel?
The midwife thought, her comment was as if she didn't expect her to pass away.
Yeah. I mean, do you realize how old she is?
Well,
I mean, do you realize how old Rachel is? She's probably 30 or 40. That's really young. She died really young. That is a very unusual thing for a biblical matriarch to be dying at such a young age. Now, we've already discussed how Jacob kind of put a curse on her and said, well, whoever stole those idols will die. This is directly, potentially related to that. And most Bible scholars, whether Christian or Jewish, think that that's what happened. Is that Jacob spoke those powerful words of a curse over her and said, whoever stole those idols will die. And that she died at the age of 35 or 40.
I know that women in the Bible days, a lot of them died during childbirth.
Oh, sure. That's absolutely true. However,
Wasn't she in childbirth?
what's that?
She was given birth.
Yes, she gives birth and she dies in childbirth, which frankly is not terribly uncommon. I mean, that was fairly common until just in the last few decades, frankly, with our advances in medicine. It's fairly uncommon today for a woman to die in childbirth, but for most of human history, yeah, bam, if you have some kind of complications or something, yeah, you could die. But what's unusual about it is that she's so young. That doesn't mitigate that factor. However, we don't read about that with any other Bible character. No, not anywhere in the Bible do we see any woman die in childbirth. And this is the matriarch of the clan of Israel. You would expect that she would have a long life. Every other person in the family lives to be a ripe old age. So it's kind of strange that she dies at 35, 40 years old. So they relate it to the curse that Jacob spoke. There's really no other explanation that people come up with. It's curious, though. Gracie?
Because further on, you'll probably know who I'm talking about. The guy he was out in battle and he said the first one that he saw.
Japheth.
Yeah. And so his daughter came out.
Yeah.
And she was the first one. And because he had made that statement with the Lord, he had to keep it. And I think it's the same thing here. I don't know why it would mesh together, but that's what it makes me think of, is the similarity.
Sure.
And when I had learned that as a kid about Japheth and his daughter, and about
Rachel.
and saying that about
yeah. Rachel.
It made me really be careful
About the power of the tongue.
and it made it when we got married, the vows that we were taking before God, those are incredibly serious, whether you know it or not.
That's right.
Doesn't change a thing.
That's right. And we, frankly, in this culture, in most Western culture, vows are very rarely said. In fact, marriage vows are some of the only vows that we take, except perhaps in America, where we pledge allegiance to our flag. That's a vow.
I've wondered about if that's proper.
Many have wondered about whether that's...
Knows that we are not putting that flag.
No, and I have thought about that too. And I know that some Christians might say, especially like a Jehovah's Witness or something, or like peaceniks or something, is like, I cannot possibly... But I don't see it in that way. Swearing allegiance to your country, that's a different thing than a God type of thing. But those are really two of the only real, vows. I mean, doctors, take a Hippocratic oath or something. But vows are...
You stand before a judge, and you lay your hand on the Bible.
And you have to swear to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the
So
truth.
help me God.
Yeah.
Very
Military, yes, absolutely. But vows generally are pretty uncommon in culture. But marriage vows are very serious. Very, very serious marriage vows are. Yeah, absolutely. You could share it, Darren. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it makes me think of how much deeper it goes, because Jacob really doesn't have the power to curse and kill anybody. That had to come from God. So it was he might have vowed it, but he couldn't withhold or keep it or do it.
True.
So she must be getting punished for something that she offended Yahweh himself.
That, and that is a good point. I would call it a good question, because I see exactly what you're saying, that yes, we can make vows with our mouths, but it really depends upon God who's going to fulfill the words of that vow, right? I mean, if Jacob doesn't have the power of life and death, not necessarily. I mean, he could kill her himself, but he's not going to, just because he spoke those words and then he finds out his wife has these idols, is he going to kill her? No. But God is in charge of that. Okay, so did God punish her? Is her death a punishment? We oftentimes begin to think that way, and we talked about this a couple of weeks back when we noticed that there's only one time that I'm aware of in Scripture where something bad happens to somebody and it is not a result of sin. Do you know what that one thing is? Do you remember that? What? The man who was born blind. And the disciples said, why was this man born blind? Was it his own sin or his parents' sin? And he said it was neither. That's the only example that I can think of.
I'll leave it alone.
Throw it out there, buddy. It's all right. Okay.
And there's some other ideas about it as well.
Okay.
All the time.
I'll talk with you about it. But no, it's a common thing for most people to think, if something bad happens to you, then you must have done something wrong, right? But you know what? That's not always true. Bad things happen. Why? Because we live in a world that has been corrupted by death and sin. We don't know that she died because she did something wrong. We don't know that she died just because Jacob spoke those words. The thought occurred to me that perhaps, and this is one thing that I have often thought about in regards to death. Why does God take a person from this earth? To us who are remaining, it seems like a horrible, terrible tragedy, right? But to God, is that a problem for God? No, He's the God of life and death. He raises people from the dead. He brings them into His presence. It's not as big of a deal to Him to take someone's life as it is to us. Because we have a very limited perspective and we're thinking, oh my gosh, this person is gone, I'll never see them again. That's not true. And God doesn't have nearly as big a problem with death as you do. So, why did she die? Maybe God wanted her. Maybe she was an idol in Jacob's life. And Jacob was holding on to her tightly and was treating her as an idol and says, I'm going to take her away from you. Is that a horrible thing? Not for God. It's not a big deal to take a life and restore a life and raise somebody to dead, give him eternal life. It's no big deal for him. It's just a big deal for us. So, why did she die? I don't know. But it is an odd death that she's so young as a Bible character. I don't know. And then, of course, she names him Ben-Oni, which is son of sorrow. What sorrow is she referring to? The sorrow that she's right now experiencing? Oh, she's about to die and she names the kid son of, oh my God, what's happening to me? That seems odd. Is she expressing that her life has been full of sorrow? From what you know of her, has her life been full of sorrow?
I think of the fact that her sister had, 6 kids before she did, and somebody else had a couple more. Finally God opened her womb.
Mm-hmm.
She had a pretty good. Back in those days, they thought if they could give your husband kids, you were,
Right.
that was the greatest gift on the face of the earth.
Yeah, she was having a hard time for a while. Angela?
I think she's sad because she's about to have a son and she's not going to be there.
Yeah? Okay, so you think that her naming him son of sorrow is referencing the current sorrow that she's experiencing? What's that?
It could be both.
It could be both. We know that she did have some struggles and some difficulties. She was struggling with her, I'm sure that her difficulties surrounding her father and her sister were a little challenging for sure. She didn't have children for a while, and she got really mad at Jacob and said, "Give me children," and he got mad at her.
If it were about that, she would have named her first son that. I think it's because she knows she's not going to be there for him.
Yeah. Okay, so then if you look at the next thing about Jacob changing the boy's name to Benjamin, the son of the right hand, what do you think he's referring to? What significance is there in this name change, Angela? Throw it out there. Don't shine me on. She's going, oh no.
I don't know, maybe I don't always have the same answer, but son of sorrow, son of the right hand. He's got,
That's a picture of what?
I see, crucifixion.
You're seeing a picture of Yeshua.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that's totally cool. I don't think that just because it's Benjamin and it's not a dude from the tribe of Judah that you can't make that connection to the Messiah. I don't.
Where's the temple?
What's that?
Whose territory is the temple in?
The temple is in the territory of Benjamin. What significance do you put for that?
I don't know. There's something about Benjamin here, and I think the Deborah thing is related, because I was just looking, and Deborah, the other Deborah, one we didn't talk about,
And Barak
yeah.
from Judges?
Says she rendered her judgments under a tree. She stood under a tree and rendered judgment.
And what tribe was she
And it
from?
says it was between the land of Ephraim and the land of Benjamin. We know Ephraim, and then we've got Benjamin showing up again. I don't know what tribe she was from, but after she defeated the Canaanites, who were the ones worshiping those idols buried under the other tree, there was peace for 40 years.
Very interesting.
Something there
Oh,
compared to Deborah.
there's most assuredly something there. Benjamin is a very mysterious individual. He's a very mysterious tribe. There's some hidden things regarding Benjamin. I mean, the fact that the temple of God was in the territory of Benjamin. There's some very interesting things about the tribe of Benjamin, which I'm not exactly sure, how to get to the root and the bottom of those things, but it's certainly curious. Yes.
How far are we away, by the way, till the temple is being
About 1,000 years.
period?
About 1,000 years. Yeah, we're about 1,000 years before the temple is built. Yeah, we've got about 300 years before the children of Israel will leave Egypt, and then we got about a period of 400 years during the time of the judges, and then we got another 150 years from the time of Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. So we got close to 1,000 years before the temple will be built. It's an interesting thing too, just as a side note, is that God never asked for a temple. That was not his idea. Curious thing. In fact, when David came up with the idea, he's like, the heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house are you going to build for me?
The same as kings, when we ask for kings.
That's right. That's right. Curious stuff. Interesting about the death of all these people being juxtaposed with the promises of fruitfulness, and especially in regards to that thing about a church of Gentiles. I think that we need to consider that Jacob and his father and his grandfather all the way back to Abraham are promised that they'll have descendants that are so numerous that you can't count them, and that like sand of the seashore and stars in the heavens. And what we consider today as the people of God, whether we want to identify them as Jews or whatever, there's no more than 14, 15, 16 million of them on the planet, right? Is that more than the stars of the heavens and more than the sand of the sea and more than you can count? No, that's a fraction. They're a serious minority on this planet. There's 7.5 billion people on this planet. And the Jews are a rather small minority. So where are all these plethora, multitudes and myriads of people that were promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? This is where you get into the two-house theory and the sons of Ephraim and Manasseh. What does it all mean? I have no idea. I think Jerry mentioned a little bit ago. Does that mean that some of you could actually be part of the 10 lost tribes of Israel? It's certainly possible. You could never prove it. Those people, they mixed with the Gentile nations, 2,500 years ago. God knows where they are now. Does that mean that the people of God, whether that's Jews or Gentile church or whatever, are just made up of Israel and Judah? No, it can't be, because there are people who are grafted in who were not a part of that. So where did all these 10 lost tribes go? I have no idea, but I do seriously think that there's a strong possibility that you're looking at them right here in front of you, that you are some of them. We don't know what happened to them. They lost in history a long, long time ago.
Yeah, Josephus references that they still knew where the tribes were even in his time. He said they're across the river for those that were divorced. But also, then you go back into the grafting in. So
Sure.
Anybody who has the faith and
Right.
the will to live it out is
Right.
grafted in. So
Right. Yeah, so there could be, there's a big mix of Goyim, who at one time were members of the house of Israel and were divorced by God and became like Gentiles. It's exactly what the prophecy said. When all of those 10 northern tribes began to get involved in idolatry, he says, I'm going to cast you out. You're going to go out there into the world. You're going to forget about me entirely, and you will become Gentiles. And then all of a sudden the world has got... And now how many Christians are there in the world? 2 billion? 2 billion.
Talk about Christians or true believers?
No, I'm not talking about true believers. I'm talking about a mix between Catholics, Protestants. I'll even throw in some Mormons and some, Jehovah's Witnesses for you if you like. But no, anybody who would self-identify as a Christian on a survey or something, yeah, you're looking at about approximately 2 billion people. Now, how many of those are real believers? Who knows? I don't know. Many people think they're Catholic because they were baptized as an infant. Angel? Identity confusion. Right back to Jacob and his identity confusion. Yes. It's a fascinating study. There's a lot of speculation out there. Don't get wrapped around the axle on two-house stuff. But it's fascinating. It's time. I apologize. I have been speaking too long. It's time for me to wrap up. Thank you for your time and attention. I don't really have anything else. There was just the Reuben sleeping with his stepmother-in-law or whatever. I think that was a coup attempt, that he was trying to take over the position of his father, trying perhaps to spoil Bilhah because Rachel died and she might have been elevated to compete with his mother, Leah. Some ideas there. That's it.
But he directly violated the Torah, because the Torah says not to do that.
He did. The Torah hasn't been given yet, but that is a clear thing from all cultures. You do not sleep with your mother-in-law. There's no excuse.
Well, the Torah wasn't given doesn't mean that they didn't know it.
That's right. I agree. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's pray. We'll get together next time and rock it.